Hello, today I'm going to talk about everything, everywhere, all at once, the complexity of gender. As I've been thinking about this topic, I randomly discovered the beautiful art and science of Maria Marian in my son's book about women in science. I found out that through her art, she was the first to document the metamorphosis of butterflies. Until her work, they did not know that butterflies develop from caterpillars. They were studying dead butterflies, not living butterflies in their natural context. As I think about this, there are so many connections and metaphors in her story, art, and research that inform or relate to the need for psychology to develop a science of gender, aiming to include the gender development of all people in all their diversities, in context and in process. The goal of this project is along those lines. It's to start laying a groundwork or developing a framework in which gender development can be understood in its inclusive contextual complexity. Just like mistakes were made in early attempts to understand butterflies and caterpillars, historical approaches to understanding gender development do not account for the complexity of gender. So even our current understandings don't account for the complexity. Something isn't working. These current / historical approaches don't, for example, account for gender diversity, such as non-binary or trans identities. They don't account for or are not accurately describing dimensions of gender. Those dimensions are often confused or blended together. And as we're going to talk about today, different identities having different rules makes it difficult to understand gender identity. We need approaches to gender development that address these limitations. So let's talk for a minute about the different rules or different understandings of identity depending on which identity is discussed. I think we might all agree that identifying as a woman or any gender is different from identifying as something like a mother or a feminist that overlaps with gender but isn't gender. For example, we tend to think of some identities as reflecting life choices, like to have children or be a feminist, whereas others, like gender identity, as not reflecting choices. So a key point I want to make is that there might be a dimension related to gender identity that is not identity per se, and thus has different quote unquote rules because it is different. So how do we do this? What's the solution? Well, spoiler alert, it is complicated, but we're going to make it easy. So attempted solutions to these problems are complicated, but that's because gender is complicated. And again, we're going to simplify this overwhelming, intimidating model so that it's easy to understand. So even simplifying the model to fewer circles on the screen and only focusing on some parts of the model, it's still complicated. So today we're going to narrow our focus and only focus on the parts highlighted with the red circles, gender orientation and gender identity. If you go back to the previous slide, you can see that these parts of the model are also present in that everywhere, everything, all at once application of the complexity model of gender. Before narrowing in our focus, I think it might be helpful to do a quick overview and simplification of the complexity model of gender. Part A is an expansion of Bronfenbrenner's ecological model. Today we can just focus on the general idea that development occurs within immediate and broad cultural contexts that influence development across the lifespan within socio-historical context. So these contexts change over historical time. Part B is emphasizing that gender identity and gender expression are different dimensions that are also in and of themselves multidimensional, that they overlap and influence one another, and also include a piece called gender orientation that we're going to talk about today. So the part that emphasizes gender orientation and that it's a related but distinct dimension of gender identity will be our next topic. All right, so the big idea, the big point that we're trying to wrap our heads around today is helped by simplifying even more and just focusing on one part of the model, as I mentioned earlier. This is the part that emphasizes the concept of gender orientation, and that gender orientation is related but a distinct dimension of gender identity. So at the most basic level, I think one somewhat simple strategy for understanding gender identity in a way that includes diverse lived experiences and fits with our broader understanding of identity, getting away from those different rules for different identities, is to lean into and expand upon existing multidimensional approaches by separating the gender self-categorization process and gender orientation from other dimensions of gender and even from gender identity. Gender orientation is defined as an inherent, enduring psychological sense of self in relation to existing gender categories and corresponding labels. Understanding identity as distinct from orientation is an approach used in the sexuality literature, where researchers such as Hammock and Van Anders have emphasized the utility of this approach, where the identity pieces of the puzzle fit better together when we recognize that you can both have an orientation and an identity. So I'm encouraging you to think about the concept of gender orientation as distinct from gender identity. To do this, let's walk through the dimensions of gender identity and related concepts. As I said earlier, one problem is specificity of what we mean when we use or study concepts related to gender. Not only are dimensions such as sex, gender identity, gender expression, and even concepts related to sexual orientation all lumped together and blended up, but even when we're specifically focused on gender identity, people, including scholars, use the term in a variety of ways, often in ways that blend dimensions. Here, this approach separates precursors to gender identity from gender identity, as well as from the effects of having gender identity and from the functions of having a specific gender identity. For example, knowledge of gender stereotypes or how others understand your gender sex is not gender identity, it's a precursor. Similarly, the pressure to conform to gender expectations is not in and of itself gender identity, but it's an effect of it. As others have focused, like Heidi Levitt, on the functions of gender, we might say that identity functions as signaling our social positions to others in a way that informs others about how to interact with us. All of these dimensions are different in that gender identity, which I know I'm kind of glossing over, but for the sake of time and emphasizing what it isn't, we can come back to and discuss further. But for now, notice that it's all working together, everything, everywhere, all at once, and over time. Again, leaning into this dimensional approach is helpful. Doing so allows us to develop an understanding of diverse gender identities that don't pull us into a nature-nurture debate or a debate about whether gender identities are a choice. You might have questions about what causes diversity in gender orientation, and I do too. Like, why are some people transgender? It's really a million, maybe $1 billion question, and I don't have the answer. I don't know. I think Anne Fausto Sterling has some really good ideas from a systems perspective, but I know that we can't, what I do know is that we can't answer the question if we're lumping and blending concepts together that are actually different. In short, it's complicated. It's everything, everywhere, all at once, and over time, reflecting development. Breaking the whole into its parts can help us solve this puzzle. We can zoom in, but also recognize that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts, and so sometimes we need to zoom back out and recognize that. So even this is complicated.